been told that you start exactly on time, so I'm waiting for the clock to click over to 8:30. My name is James Kraska, and I'm in the International Law Department. And the game plan for this morning is that I'll talk a little bit about law of the sea and its relationship with maritime security. I'll go for maybe 45 minutes or an hour at the most, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you might have, other than those questions that you've been assigned for Monday. And then we'll take a 15-minute break, and I'll then pass the baton to my department head, Professor Mike Schmidt, who's going to talk about international law and the use of force, or the term in Latin, jus ad bellum. So let's get started. This is sort of the Navy perspective, or the joint maritime perspective of the oceans. And this looks at the globe with the oceans as the world's largest three-dimensional maneuver space. And maneuver is used in order to inject a local superiority of force anywhere on the globe. So you can have tactical superiority, or you could have strategic superiority. And this reflection of the globe is, of course, made famous by the 1890 book by Alfred Thayer Mahan, whom you've probably encountered at least once already at the War College. And Mahan kind of raised this type of paradigm, and it has led to others who have somewhat disagreed with it. For example, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, FDR Secretary of War, said that in the Navy is subject to a peculiar psychology in which we recede into a dim religious worldview in which Neptune is God, Mahan his prophet, and the U.S. Navy the one true church. So these are the different levels of warfare that you're very familiar with, and there are implications in the law of the sea and maritime security law for each one of those. And so we'll talk about a couple of these. The first, of course, being tactical, and most of you are probably familiar with encountering law at the tactical level. And for those that are in the Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard team, or the maritime team, or oftentimes the Air Force flying over water, you will have encountered aspects of the law that affect your tactical operations. At the operational or theater level, international law and law of the sea in particular are drivers that shape they both enable the commander, and then they sometimes may limit the commander. And then at the strategic level, it's important to remember that the United States is a maritime nation. You might think of the U.S. as essentially a large island nation with secure borders both on the north and the south, at least historically. And therefore, as an island nation, the United States can be very much placed in the category of the United Kingdom or Japan. And from a strategic perspective, the U.S. has maintained connections with its allies both in Europe and in Asia through the sea lines of communication. And therefore, the laws that pertain to the oceans have been important for the United States, and also, frankly, have incited a number of military actions. If you think about the United States in the history, what is the first war that the country fought as an independent country? The quasi-war with France. So somebody's seen the movie before. And the second war that the United States fought as an independent country, the First Barbary War. And does everybody recall what the quasi-war with France was about? It was a maritime conflict, a sort of asymmetric conflict, and it was with regard to France boarding U.S. ships because after the Jay Treaty, in which the United States had a rapprochement with Great Britain, France felt jilted because France, of course, had provided a lot of funds as well as naval force to help the U.S. secure its independence from the British. The ungrateful Americans then moved closer to the British, and that risked affecting the balance of power in Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. So France started interdicting U.S. trade going to Great Britain. So that was the first war. The second war was the Barbary Pirates, again, a war about freedom of navigation. The third war that the United States fought as an independent country was which conflict? War of 1812, again, over the issue of impressment of seafarers, American seafarers, which the United Kingdom claimed with some truth as well as with some untruth that they were Royal Navy sailors who had sought a better deal in the U.S. merchant fleet. And then the fourth war was that the U.S. fought as an independent country was the Second Barbary War, when the U.S. ended the business model of the Barbary principalities of the Ottoman Empire. Again, a war over freedom of navigation. Could do a whole history of this. In fact, it has been done. If you look at World War I and unrestricted submarine warfare, World War II and the sea lines of communication, and going all the way through the Atlantic Alliance and the Cold War, the United States has been strategically connected through sea lines to the rest of the world. So can you advance the slide? Well, there's always a temptation by countries to try to monopolize or to try to internalize the benefits of the ocean and exclude others from that resource, from that spatial domain. And it has a strategic dimension. Today you can see the strategic dimension being played out, for example, in the South China Sea. And we'll talk a little about that. But really in the modern era, that is over the last 500 years or so, the contemporary international law era, the point of origin is the Treaty of Tordesillas. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas followed a papal bull or a edict issued by the Pope in 1492. After the discovery of the New World, Spain and Portugal both made a play for securing title to the riches of the New World, neither of which knew the full scope of what they had discovered, or even whether it was the Indies, or whether it was Asia, or whether it was a new continent. Nonetheless, they both moved, jockeying for position in favor with the Pope to get the Pope to recognize their claims. The Pope issued a papal bull, which was then codified in the Treaty of Tordesillas 2 years later in 1494. And what it said was that, that Portugal would be granted this sphere of influence in the red circle, and that Spain would have everything beyond that. So you can see that this explains a lot of the history. It explains all of the Portuguese exploration along the African coast, why this was not Spanish exploration. The outpost of Goa in Italy. It explains the initial Portuguese assertion of ownership over the Moluccas, or Indonesia, present-day Indonesia, which was then taken from them by the Dutch. And it also explains why Brazil speaks Portuguese rather than Spanish. Everything else was regarded as, you remember in the old pirate movies, the Spanish Main, or the Spanish mainland, which was Latin America today. So these countries sought to exclude all the other countries from these spheres of influence in a very legalistic way. They claimed title to these areas. Well, not every country agreed with that, including first the Dutch. And the Dutch really can be credited a lot with forming the modern conception of the law of the sea, because the Dutch come from a common law tradition. And the common law tradition can be distinguished from the civil law tradition of Rome, or what is now reflected in the continent of Europe, the European Union, France, Germany, Russia. And these are very different ways of looking at law. For the Dutch, they have a liberal notion of the law. That's a small L. in which people, and then at the international level, states can interact freely so long as they do not violate the rights of another state. And so you see this in common law. You've heard the old adage that a fellow's rights extend up to the point of the other fellow's nose. This is the foundation of freedom of speech, foundation of sort of the liberal social scene, I guess, that you have in the United Kingdom. And then it has been passed on through the British and the United States, and even it has elements throughout all of the Commonwealth, but particularly Canada and Australia. So this common law notion is that the oceans can't be owned by any one country, and that cuts very much against the civil law or the continental European perspective, which is unlike the common law, where you can do anything so long as it's not forbidden. In the civil law system, you virtually can't do much or can't do anything hardly unless it's specified in the civil code. These are the things that are permitted, and that's why Napoleon, for example, had the Napoleonic Code written. Very detailed, multi-volume rules about what can be done, following the Roman model or the Justinian model from the Roman Emperor Justinian of trying to record all of those things that could be done. Now, within the U.S. Armed Forces, can you see any of this reflected, this sort of approach? Which service tends to have more of a lackadaisical attitude, should we say, about specific rules? It's becoming less so because the world is globalized and the force is now joint, 25, 30 years after Goldwater-Nichols. Which service? The Navy, obviously. So you can see how these are reflected. You can also see the approach of that this helps explain this wiring that we have, or the socialization that we're accustomed to in the law, explains some of the differences of view between, for example, the United States and the European Union countries. It's reflected throughout. Well, these are just several other examples of the United States in contemporary times where the issue of freedom of navigation seems to butt up against the corresponding claim of coastal states to assert jurisdiction or control out into the water. If you recall the case of the SS Mayaguez, this was really the last conflict, the last eruption of violence involving the U.S. in the China War. This was where Cambodia sent out ships beyond the territorial sea, small boats, and attacked the SS Mayaguez, which was a military Sea Lift Command contracted vessel. Raises some interesting questions because, unlike a warship, a contracted vessel may not have sovereign immune status, or at least that status is placed in controversy. So from the Cambodian perspective, they could say, look, this was just a commercial vessel and we happened to go out and take action against it. Of course, from the U.S. perspective, this was a violation of freedom of navigation. You can see this sort of dynamic playing out even today. You're going to look at the tanker war on Monday, but also if you think of just a couple of years ago, the case of the Mavi Marmara and the Free Gaza movement and the Israeli boarding of that ship. It raises some of the same questions. The other incident is the USS Pueblo, an intelligence ship that was operating off the coast of North Korea, and of course it's now a museum in North Korea. If you have a chance to visit, it's a lovely attraction. Okay, so this takes us to the contemporary law of the sea. The law of the sea arose out of this clash over coastal states asserting jurisdiction, these claims based upon sovereignty, based upon security, and more recently based upon environmental protection since the late 1960s. And that set of claims coming up against claims from the liberal order of the oceans, the Anglo-Saxon American perspective of freedom of the seas. Freedom to use the seas is what India calls it. Again, another Commonwealth country. Their maritime strategy, freedom to use the seas. Same type of perspective. So from 1973 to 1982, operating through 11 different conferences, each conference was a good 6-week boondoggle in New York City or Geneva, so I'm sure it was a delight. And more than 130 countries got together to negotiate and try to codify the rules for the law of the sea to avoid things like the Quasi-War or the Pueblo incident or the Mayaguez. And after 9 years of weeping and gnashing of teeth, there emerged a final product that was then adopted by the conference. So if you've seen the term UNCLOS, which stands for the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea, that is the UNCLOS 3, Roman numeral 3, is the third United Nations Conference. That is the third attempt, because the first two attempts in 1958 and 1960 were largely failures. So that was the third attempt, UNCLOS 3, and UNCLOS 3 produced, confusingly enough, UNCLOS, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the UN Conference, number 3, produced the convention, and the convention codified the rules and was considered a package deal. The reason why is because it has rules favorable to both coastal states as well as rules that promote freedom of navigation, both for civil or merchant shipping, as well as military uses of the oceans and the military mobility. We'll talk about each of these zones. The Law of the Sea Convention recognized and codified zones, which are depicted here. And then within each zone, there is a navigational regime. And by regime, I'm using that in the sense, if you're from a political science background, Stephen Krasner's sense of a regime is a rule set or mores around which expectations converge, which just means to say that a regime is a rule set that there's an expectation that other countries will adhere to. So there's some stability of expectations in the law of the sea in a way to avoid incidents like we talked about with the Mayaguez or the Pueblo, and there's numerous others. I mean, if you can just sit down and think, you can think of the Gulf of Sidra. I mean, there's literally dozens of incidents. The EP3 incident with China, just a long catalog of incidents, and that's just involving the United States. Many other countries have their own narrative to tell. So let's go through these zones and also think about, just quickly, the regimes for navigation, both airspace as well as surface and subsurface, that can apply and how those are going to affect military operations. First of all, with regard to the law of the sea, I'll deal with it up front because it's an issue of great interest to people, and there's always a question on it. I'll be glad to talk more about it. But the question is, well, why isn't the United States a party to the Law of the Sea Convention? Most people know that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea now has over 160 states parties, including virtually every major power and every major maritime power. There are a few holdouts, including Turkey is a holdout, as well as Israel for various reasons, as well as the United States, which is somewhat ironic because the United States led much of the negotiations in the Law of the Sea Convention, and ironically worked with not just the major maritime powers of Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Japan, but also the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. So that's something that most people don't realize, is that the United States worked in tandem with the Soviet Union in order to secure freedom of navigation in the Law of the Sea Convention, setting aside the Cold War animosity. So in 1982, the convention was adopted at the conference, and the Reagan administration said, we will not sign the convention. We refuse to sign the convention because of the portion on seabed mining in Part 11. And that Part 11 does not have a lot of military equity. It has some that we could look at from a strategic perspective or from the perspective of submarine cables and jurisdiction over submarine cables, which are now somewhat important. After, all internet traffic, virtually 95%, goes by submarine cable rather than satellite. But let's set that aside. The disagreements between the United States and the treaty over the seabed mining portion really revolved around ideology and a distaste in Part 11 for what it reflected with the new international economic order, or essentially socialist rather than Marxist principles of seabed mining beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So that is beyond, well, you have the mental image, right, of the schematic. So beyond 200 miles and then even farther out than that, the seabed mining provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention related to how resources beyond areas of national jurisdiction were going to be divided up, how these would be divvied up. In the United States and some other countries at the time, West Germany and a number of other countries, opposed this sort of socialist scheme. The short story is that Part 11 was revised in 1994 through successful negotiations between the Clinton administration and the United Nations. And as a result, the problems in Part 11 were fixed. What was the major intervening event between 1982 and 1994? The end of the Cold War, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the sort of final realization for anyone who had any doubt that socialism doesn't lead to economic prosperity, health of the population, environmental safety and protection, and all of the rest. And so because of those events, there was a door that was opened, Part 11 was revised. So President Reagan said, but for Part 11, the United States supports the convention. And in fact, not only does it support the convention, but the United States expects other countries to comply with the terms of the convention in terms of those navigational regimes, and that the United States would adhere to those same navigational regimes. All of the regimes that were, or all of the zones that were put up on the board a couple of slides ago have their starting point at the baseline. And so anytime you think about reviewing the law of the sea and looking at what rules apply, because what rules apply are geographically oriented or geographically situated, and so you want to maintain, just like as an operational officer, you maintain situational awareness. You do the same thing from a legal perspective. So all of the zones begin at the baseline, and the baseline is the low water mark running along the coast. That is a normal baseline, and so in normal circumstances, that is the line from which you would start to draw the zones in the law of the sea. Everything landward of the baseline, this is actually the Nile flowing north here into the Mediterranean. You see at the top, this is the inner harbor of of Baltimore. So landward of the baseline, rivers, bays, harbors, these bodies of water constitute internal waters over which the coastal state has complete plenary legal authority. And there is no right to enter enter into those waters at all, period. And then, of course, like everything in the law, except in terms of, except in situations of duress. Although the scope of duress and the shape of that exception is up to some debate. Next slide, please. So internal waters are, constitute the complete, under the complete sovereignty and jurisdiction of the coastal state. And here you see not just rivers, lakes, canals, but you see a straight baseline that's connecting these islands that seems to claim more than just strictly internal waters. And so you get countries that now have the temptation to draw that baseline farther out than the low water mark. Well, what's the incentive to do that? It's free water space, so it's free resource. Everything, politics is about the division of the scarce resources among the many people and the many needs, the many wants. You know, for the United States, for example, it's how do we spend the $1 trillion that we borrow every year? That's our politics. Well, in the case of the law of the sea, it's there's a fixed amount of water space on the planet, and I want to get mine or more than mine. And so countries understand that if they can draw their baseline farther out into the water, that pushes out all of the other zones that we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. Iran, for example, is able to, has claimed a excessive straight baseline, and there's sort of a psychological element to this, that it's somewhat comforting if you're a coastal state to just kind of draw a straight line in the water and say, this is my, to use Colonel Gaddafi's statement, I mean, this is my line of death, so to speak, and we are going to internalize the benefits of this water space, and in doing so, we externalize the cost onto the international community. We're going to take exclusive control over it, and we're going to thereby impose a cost on the rest of us. It's as though you have, it's as though you violate the rules, and you know, you're in New York City and you put up, I don't know, whatever they do, a garbage can or a cone or whatever to try to reserve a parking space that really everybody else ought to have access to. So you can see here, the red line would be the 12-mile territorial sea that Iran would be authorized if it adhered to the Law of the Sea Convention, and the black line is the Iranian excessive maritime claim. It's just an arbitrary line that has maybe some strategic rationale and certainly has a psychological benefit. Next slide. Well, the Law of the Sea Convention is I would suggest is the most important agreement or treaty in existence after the UN Charter. Like the UN Charter, the Law of the Sea Convention is an umbrella agreement, and underneath this umbrella agreement, there are literally more than 50 other treaties, hundreds of codes and guidelines, that many of them promulgated by the International Maritime Organization in London, the member states of the IMO. And so as a result, there's because the Law of the Sea Convention is an umbrella agreement, there is a fair amount of ambiguity with regard to its terms. So lawyers love ambiguity. That's sort of the hook for full employment for lawyers. And so countries try to leverage this ambiguity in order to promote their interests or what they perceive as their interests, either economic or environmental or military interests. One of the most exploited ways of leveraging ambiguity in the Law of the Sea Convention is looking at alternatives to drawing a normal baseline along the coast. Because as we mentioned, if we can draw the line farther out into the water, then we get something for nothing. We can claim it's like getting a piece of Antarctica with your own title. You get part of the global commons, and you can internalize the benefits for whatever you perceive those benefits to be, fish or security, standoff security zones or whatever. So straight baselines are allowed in the Law of the Sea Convention, and they were designed to bring on board specific countries, primarily Norway, that has these deeply indented and cut into fords along its coast. And so a country like Norway said, look, these are really deeply indented and cut into. In order for me to join the Law of the Sea Convention, I've got to be able to have a way to sort of draw a straight line. Otherwise, it would just be sort of impractical, and in a sense, it's unfair not to give that coastline kind of a smoothing out. Well, all the other countries then, accepting the package deal and realizing at the time that this isn't really designed for them, still see an opening, and they make, it's like taking the home office exemption. Gee, you're studying at home, and you've got your Naval War College iPad there, and you're kind of looking around thinking, this guest bedroom, I only have my mother-in-law come in here once a year. Why not, this could be my home office exemption. And so you start to look at rules, and people naturally, and it's all natural, we all do it, countries and people start to think about how those rules can restrain their conduct less, or actually promote what they want. So these are the rules with regarding straight baselines, drawing a line connecting islands or connecting a deeply indented coast. And the rule also says that in addition to having either of these two scenarios for a straight baseline, that there also has to be a connection between the coastline and the water, whatever that means. If you can figure it out, you can write an article about it. And in addition to that, there has to be a connection, and the straight baseline has to follow the general direction of the coast. Well, all you have to do is get up in an airplane, and the higher up you go, the more you can make it look like it follows the general direction of the coast. For example, this line right here is 90 degrees perpendicular to the coast. Does that follow the general direction? Well, it depends on how far out you go. Next slide. So these are the rules that are now sort of animating some of these rules in the South China Sea disagreement, which I'll just touch on shortly. We have normal baselines, then we have straight baselines, and then you also have historic internal waters, which allows countries to draw straight baselines even if the coastline is not deeply indented or cut into, even if there's not a fringe of islands, but if this area constitutes historic internal waters. This is what Libya had claimed with the Gulf of Sidra. That is that going out into the Mediterranean 200 miles and drawing a 300-mile closing line straight across the Gulf of Sidra, that constituted historic internal waters. Well, it's easy to claim historic internal waters. What are some legitimate examples? Possibly Chesapeake Bay in the United States. I would personally argue that Hudson Bay in Canada constitutes historic waters. And there are legitimate examples, but of course, like every rule, it's subject to abuse. And what we have on the right-hand side here is the now famous, I don't know if anybody's not heard of China's 9-dashed line. China claims this line from a Republic of China post-World War II map that says that this is an area with some sort of vacuous claim of China's historic interest, historic presence, sovereignty. It's never really been defined, despite numerous countries asking for clarification. China has claimed that the area inside this 9-dash line constitutes Chinese historic waters, that China owns the water or the features or both. Again, it's not entirely clear, and there's some sort of value from a Chinese diplomacy standpoint in maintaining that ambiguity. So you've probably heard that there's been a lot of disagreement because, next slide please, the countries that are positioned around the South China Sea, next slide please. The countries positioned around the Law of the Sea want to this is the 9-dash line right here. And the countries positioned or situated around here, particularly Vietnam and the Philippines, have said, well, wait a minute, that's all nice, but under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, these coastal states are entitled to all of the normal zones. And the normal zones are a 12 nautical mile territorial sea and a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which is this magenta line of the overlapping exclusive economic zones. Now, that doesn't take into account all of these small features that are occupied by different countries in the South China Sea, and the ones that have been invaded by China, first in 1974, taking the paracels from South Vietnam. At the time, the South Vietnam, of course, the government was teetering, so China saw a power vacuum, in essence, and they took the Paracel Islands up on the upper left, and then in 1988, they started occupying more of the Vietnamese features. Go back one. Back one slide. So yeah, forward. Yeah, right there. So this is one of the features, and to further sort of complicate this story, the Law of the Sea Convention says, look, coastal states are entitled to this 12 nautical mile territorial sea. They're entitled to a 200-mile economic zone, and those zones are measured from islands. Well, what's an island? Is this an island? An island is a piece of land that is capable of sustaining human habitation. So what does that mean? Once again, it sort of begs the question, what's capable of sustaining human habitation? I mean, I guess with enough money and helicopters, you know, you could live on your own beach paradise here. Normally, human habitation means, does it have a freshwater source? And so there's really only one of these features in the South China Sea that has its own fresh water. It's occupied by Republic of China, Taiwan. So one of these probably constitutes an island and therefore generates its own exclusive economic zone. Now, rocks are less than islands. Rocks are land formations that are above water at high tide. That is, they are different from a formation that covers and uncovers according to the tides. So many of these things out in, go forward please, one slide. Many of these features out in the South China Sea are, go forward one slide please, are merely rocks. That is, these features, there we go. These features cover and uncover. So you've heard all of the controversy recently, about a month or 6 weeks ago, about the standoff at Scarborough Reef and this sort of back and forth between China and the Philippines. Well, from a legal perspective, Scarborough Reef, located this far out, has absolutely no independent legal significance. It's in the Philippine exclusive economic zone, and so its waters under the jurisdiction of the Philippines. There should be no controversy, and that's the same with all of these, with the possible exception of, and I'm not sure which one it is, but it's around in here, the one that's occupied by Taiwan, that may in fact have a freshwater source and therefore generate a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. The point is that you've got a lot of, I would suggest, sort of imposed by China, sort of resurrecting a lot of the, asserting jurisdiction over these areas and resurrecting some of the disputes in an effort to claim features that, in all frankness, probably have legal insignificance. But because there's enough ambiguity in the convention, and we know that power is the other side of the coin from diplomacy and law, there's an interest in China in order to occupy these and make claims based upon the law of the sea. So this clicker's not working. Can you advance the slides one? Okay. So let's take it to a different area of the world. This is the Canadian Arctic. Canada has made straight baseline claims as well. What it shows you is that countries that make straight baseline claims, it's a temptation that many countries experience. And there are a few countries that probably have the cleanest shirt, so to speak. I would suggest that Singapore, the United States, Japan, all of these countries are maritime countries, with Singapore not only being a small maritime power, but more importantly being entirely dependent on global trade for its economy, have tended to have conservative claims in the oceans. Whereas land-oriented countries, or land powers, more accurately, have tended to have more grandiose claims. Well, Canada, our closest ally to the north, I would suggest has excessive maritime claims, here depicted in this red line, in which Canada has drawn a straight baseline encompassing all of the islands of the Canadian Arctic, including, of course, the passages that constitute the Northwest Passage. And what I would suggest here is that, and then the yellow line is the 12-mile territorial sea that's claimed by Canada. You can see I don't know if you can see these numbers here, like 556, 667, 408, 157. These are depths in meters, so this is a fairly wide and deep channel. Now, historically, it has been covered by ice. Now it is being uncovered over parts of the summer, 60, at the most 90 days, and there's an expectation that it will have a larger and larger amount of time in which it is free of ice, and then that is going to bring this long-standing set of disputes over the Northwest Passage more to the front table. One other thing I would mention here is you can decide, for yourself as to whether this meets either the historic claims test. If you remember back in the first slide of the 9-dash line, I put up on the left side the historic test for the claim for historic waters. What's the claim for historic internal waters? That the country must assert control over the area, must have done so for a continuous amount of time. We're not really sure how long, but it's got to be a long time. And then finally, that the international community has to acquiesce in that claim. Well, in this instance, both the European Union and the United States have diplomatically rejected these claims, just like they have in the South China Sea with regard to China's 9-dash line. Canada has not relented. I mean, they've maintained their position. I would suggest that when you have an area like the McClure Strait here that's 98 nautical miles wide, then there's very little rationale to be able to draw that as a straight baseline. Remember, a normal baseline runs along the coast. There are exceptions for straight baselines. There's the deeply indented coastline, or there's the fringe of islands. And you can draw the straight baseline then so long as it follows the general direction of the coast. Well, once again here, if you look at the McClure Strait, I mean, this is basically, almost a 90-degree departure on both entrances. On the right side over here in the east, it's 48 nautical miles wide. So this is a fairly, wide passage through here. And, so there's, I think the rationale that you can draw straight baselines there is fairly weak. It just doesn't meet the test. It doesn't meet the historic test because other countries haven't acquiesced, and it doesn't meet the tests of departure from a normal baseline. Yes?
Just a question before moving. You mentioned that for historical waters need to be, third point need to be consent of neighbor.
The acquiescence. The acquiescence of the international community. Of course, the neighbors are a subset of that, but it's the international community. So it's not the consent, it's the acquiescence. It's the Well, both. I mean, the neighbors are part of the international community.
Sometimes when neighbors are part of a sense, excuse me, so how does this affect the international community?
I mean, what specific issue are you talking about?
You know, if the neighbors are okay with what they decide, is bothering the international community by this?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, it's undefined. It's just the international community. You know, how much is the international community? It's like how fat is fat? I mean, I just don't know. You know. Okay. Now remember when I said that you have features like Scarborough Shoal and most of the features in the South China Sea that have legal insignificance or they are irrelevant. The reason they are irrelevant is because they only have a legal effect if they are already within a territorial sea of a coastal state. So if they are within the territorial sea, the 12 nautical mile territorial sea of the coastal state, then they can be given legal effect to bump out the territorial sea that much farther. But when they're beyond the coast, like the Scarborough Reef is far out to sea, then they are legally insignificant if they are rocks that cover and uncover. So remember, just to recap on the issue of islands very quickly, if it's capable of sustaining human habitation, it's a no-kidding island with a freshwater source, then it generates a 200-mile exclusive economic zone and, of course, a 12-mile territorial sea. If it's a rock that's always above water, then generally it creates a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Was there a comment over here? Okay. Now there are some disputes about that because some countries would claim that even if it's a rock, if it's a tiny rock, it's not going to have a territorial sea. If it's a fairly major rock like Rocca Corbatina that's owned by Mexico, I mean that's a fairly substantial, you can sort of, you know, you're on a ship and you come up, it's like a mountain coming out of the water. I mean that's going to have a 12 nautical mile territorial sea. Whereas if it's, you know, literally something like, you know, you've seen the pictures of the Chinese soldiers standing in, you know, with water up to their shins on a coral reef, that might not pass the test. Well, now that we've talked about sort of the zones from a strategic perspective, I'm just going to go through rather quickly and look at the navigational regimes. I think everybody's probably familiar with how innocent passage applies in the territorial sea. The territorial sea constitutes the sovereign water space and airspace of the coastal state, and it is measured 12 nautical miles seaward of a lawfully drawn baseline. So if I draw my baseline like North Korea and it's 50 miles out in the water, that doesn't necessarily mean that other countries are going to adhere to that. So it's 12 miles from a lawfully drawn baseline, and within the territorial sea, the coastal state can enforce measures against foreign flagged ships, can enforce safety, can enforce criminal law, environmental protection, so long as there's really two elements. So long as the enforcement does not affect the construction, design, equipping, and manning of the vessel, CDEM. CDEM rules are preserved for the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, the specialized UN agency for maritime matters. And the member states of it's not the Secretariat of the IMO that just issues edicts, it's the member states of the IMO that come together and develop those rules on construction, design, equipping, and manning. This is to prevent a coastal state from saying, okay, we have a special rule, we don't like country X, and country X is conducting innocent passage, and our special rule is that there's no exhalation of oxygen by human beings to contaminate our precious environment as you transit through the territorial sea. And the international community would say, we all love clean air, we all care about air quality standards and diesel stack emissions, but there's a reasonableness test, and those rules are folded into construction design, equipping, and manning, and are promulgated at the IMO by the member states and agreed to by the international community. You can't have sort of extreme rules or rules that only apply to certain countries. Otherwise, it would hamper global trade. So there are some things that are not permitted in innocent passage. The main takeaways are on the right-hand side here. That is, submarines must be on the surface and show their flag. There is no right of submerged transit in innocent passage. There's no right to innocent passage with submarines under the water. And aircraft are not entitled to innocent passage at all. They must obtain the consent of the coastal state in order to transit through the 12-mile territorial sea. Coastal states are also entitled to a contiguous zone. That means a zone running contiguous or along the territorial sea, equidistant from the territorial sea, and that stretches another 12 miles out into the water. Now, this zone also, like many of the rules in the law of the sea, are prone to sort of mischief-making by states that want to take liberties with what is permitted in order to reshape the rules to advance certain interests. The contiguous zone is a zone that allows the coastal state to project jurisdiction for enforcement for 4 purposes. For customs, fiscal, immigration, I'll take those 3 first. For those 3 purposes, these are to avoid customs violations by internationally flagged ships. So for example, if I want to run a gambling casino 13 miles off the coast, and people can come out from Newport, from Narragansett Bay, and they can come on board my ship, and we can gamble. They can gamble to their heart's delight, even though, you know, just assume that the coastal state wants to regulate it or tax it or whatever. And they can do so free of all of those hassles of the coastal state, free of, you know, having to pay the local politicians in order to open up your casino or whatever. This is conduct that would likely violate the rules that the coastal state can issue with regard to the contiguous zone, because these are enforcement issues that affect the coastal state directly. Now, the greatest confusion is with regard to sanitation, because this is a somewhat ambiguous term that some countries have said sanitation means sort of anything that's dirty. Anything that's dirty is the environment, and therefore that gives the coastal state license to impose all sorts of environmental measures on vessel source pollution or on other activities. For example, let's say the use of sonar that might have some sort of even minuscule but nonetheless measurable effect on the marine environment. All of that those are all issues that can be discussed, but it doesn't apply in the contiguous zone because sanitation means health rules. It means quarantine for diseases, Ebola or SARS, and those sorts of things. So what this rule allows is it allows coastal states to go out to 24 nautical miles and board ships that may be infected, or to check for their health status, or to see what sort of contagious disease might be on board and how that might affect the coastal state. It's not a general license for environmental management. Let's move on to strategic straits. These are some of the strategic straits in the world. There are 130 straits, at least, throughout the world. This is a classic strait. So what is a strait? A strait is an area of the high seas that connects another area of the high seas or exclusive economic zone. So that is one area beyond 12 nautical miles connected through a body of water with another area beyond 12 nautical miles. This is the Strait of Gibraltar. Well, interestingly then, straits have a dual status, and this is often missed when you're reading news accounts. For example, if you're reading about the Strait of Hormuz in Iran, Iran will say, correctly, that the Strait of Hormuz largely constitutes Iranian territorial sea. Okay, no problem. But what is not mentioned is that it has a dual status. It may at the same time be territorial sea, in which case, which regime applies? We just talked about it, innocent passage. But in the case of a territorial sea that connects one part of the high seas to another part of the high seas, there's an overlay of another navigational regime, the regime of transit passage through international straits. And transit passage is very different from innocent passage, because transit passage allows you to use aircraft. Go forward. Oh, here we go. To use aircraft. Submarines can be under the water. Aircraft can fly in the air. Countries can conduct formation steaming. They can take measures, special measures for anti-terrorism and force protection, launching and recovering of military devices and aircraft, and the rest. So it's a very much of a robust navigational regime that's quite different from mere innocent passage. This is similar. Archipelagic passage is similar to transit passage, and it applies to archipelagic states. I'm actually going to skip the details because it's a fairly complex area, and it only applies to archipelagos, nations which are composed wholly of islands, such as obviously Indonesia and the Philippines. There are some others, Bahamas. And it's not just nations composed of islands, but nations composed of islands that have a correct ratio of land to water of 1:1 to 9:1. So countries that have too much water, like Mauritius or the Seychelles, or too much land, like Canada or Greece or the United States, despite having a lot of islands, still do not qualify. So it's an empirical test based upon the ratio of water to land. And the test was designed in order to bring on board countries like Indonesia and the Philippines into the Law of the Sea Convention. Well, what does this allow? Being an archipelagic state allows Indonesia to draw straight baselines around this entire mass of islands and call this area internal waters. Well, does this look familiar? It's exactly what Canada is attempting to do with the Northwest Passage. But of course, with Canada, they have far too much land to qualify, just like the United States could not draw a straight line around the Hawaiian Islands and say that that's the Hawaiian archipelago, and the internal waters applies the regime of the zone of internal waters is inside. With regard to this archipelago and these internal archipelagic waters, there are a few different navigational regimes that apply. There's transit passage through straits, which you see illuminated here in red and yellow. And then there's also innocent passage in those areas that do not constitute straits. So there's still freedom of movement, but it's more controlled than just regular high seas freedoms. Now the exclusive economic zone. This is the 200-mile zone that originated as a fishing zone in the negotiations for the Law of the Sea Convention. It constitutes 36% of the global ocean space. And just as its name suggests, it's a zone in which the coastal state has exclusive rights to explore and exploit both living and non-living resources of the ocean, of the water column. So this is not an area in which the coastal state owns this water. There's no sovereignty. There's only sovereignty over internal waters in the territorial sea. There's no sovereignty over the contiguous zone. There is jurisdiction in the contiguous zone for those four purposes that I put up. In the exclusive economic zone, there is jurisdiction and there are sovereign rights over the living and non-living resources, but not sovereignty. And the distinction is important because some countries have started to claim sovereignty either over the airspace or over the surface of the water or underwater. You know, the limitation with regard to the high seas is really, there are several, but the most important is that the high seas must be used in accordance with the law of the Sea Convention, the high seas must be used only for peaceful purposes. And that also pertains to the exclusive economic zone, because under Articles 58 and 82 of the law of the Sea Convention, all of the rules that apply in the high seas, an area of sort of open navigational regime, apply in the exclusive economic zone to the extent that those rules do not interfere with the rights of the living and non-living resources of the coastal state. So the exclusive economic zone was cut out of the high seas, and it was, if you think of it as an exemption or an easement for the coastal state to be able to assert control over the resources, but not over the area generally. The United States has, among other countries, protested the claims of coastal states when they do not comport with the rules in the law of the Sea Convention. And one of the ways we do this is through the Freedom of Navigation program, in order to demonstrate non-acquiescence of excessive maritime claims. And the Freedom of Navigation program is run jointly by Department of State and Department of Defense, and it challenges all countries, not just countries that may be potential adversaries, but it challenges the excessive claims of friends and partner nations, that are very close to the U.S., including Japan, with which we have an alliance that's the cornerstone of stability in East Asia. The United States has challenged a few of Japan's excessive claims. We've contested Australia's excessive claims, as well as some other countries, and of course China remains somewhat of a standout because in the last 2 decades, China is the only country that has taken forceful measures in order to try to enforce excessive maritime claims against U.S. ships and aircraft. These are some of the countries that we've conducted FON operations. These are not even all of them. It's about half of them over the past decade. Virtually any country that has an excessive maritime claim is bound to be subject to a freedom of navigation assertion, an operational assertion by a U.S. ship or aircraft. Well, let's move on to maritime security operations and think this moves more toward your exercise on Monday with regard to the tanker war. And specifically, I'm not going to talk about the initiation of the use of force or more grand matters of war and peace. And those are going to be covered by Professor Schmidt, who's going to follow after the break. What I'll talk about here are peacetime maritime security operations and some of the rules in the law of the sea that allow states to conduct MSO. First of all, what are MSO? Maritime security operations is a catch-all phrase that encompasses counter-piracy, counter-drug trafficking, migrant smuggling, and of course, interdiction of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, and terrorists at sea. What are some of the basic rules for maritime security operations? Well, if you look at the law of the Sea Convention, as an operator, you'd be concerned about what are your rules that can facilitate visit, board, search, and seizure of ships. And this is something that obviously concerns the Coast Guard and the Navy and sometimes the Marine Corps on a continuous basis. What are the rationale for visit, board, search, and seizure? In the law of the Sea Convention, under Articles 92 and 94, the coastal state, the flag state has basically plenary authority over the ship that flies its flag. So if you're a naval commander and you see another ship and you have some interest in boarding that ship, that's the first sort of starting point when you're thinking through potential basis for boarding, that the flag state has plenary authority over that ship. So one of the first things to think about if you want to board the ship is, will the flag state let you, or has the flag state already given you prior agreement? The Coast Guard has more than 30 agreements with states in Latin America and the Caribbean that allow Coast Guard boarding, and actually Navy and Coast Guard teams to board ships in certain circumstances, or that have expedited decision-making apparatus that allows a quick response from the coastal state. So if it's St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the ship is say, an oil tanker that's flagged in that country, there may be an agreement with the country that says, if we ask you if we can board this ship, because under Article 92 and 94, you have authority over that vessel, will you give us an answer in 4 hours, some operationally significant time? If we don't hear from you, may we assume that we can board after 4 hours? There's all kinds of agreements like that. Each country has its own sort of particular interests or particular desires, and so there's some variation among these agreements. What are other bases for visit, board, search, and seizure? Under Article 110 of the Law of the Sea Convention, even without the consent of the flag state, countries can board other countries' ships in certain circumstances. Well, one of those circumstances is if there's a reasonable suspicion that the vessel is a pirated vessel. Another circumstance is if there's a reasonable suspicion that the ship is involved in slave trafficking. Well, what about drug trafficking or weapons of mass destruction? There's not provisions in the Law of the Sea Convention to board ships without the consent of the flag state in those circumstances. But there are other agreements that may provide authority if the flag state and the boarding state are a party to them. All of these boarding questions bring up what I would suggest is a Rubik's Cube, in particular with regard to piracy. We've seen, why can't we just solve the problem of piracy, assuming that you can have some effect at water more so than on land? Obviously, it's going to take both efforts. But when you look at issues of boarding on the water and involving piracy, there are a lot of players involved. There's a lot of countries with equities and both political and legal interests. And so each case constitutes a Rubik's Cube that you have to solve. And so it's very difficult to sort of, you have to continue to reinvent the wheel each time. One of the agreements that's intended to fill a hole or fill a gap in boarding is the suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of maritime navigation. This is really an omnibus counterterrorism and counter weapons of mass destruction agreement, which was negotiated in the 1980s after the Achille Lauro incident, in which the Achille Lauro, the Italian-flagged cruise liner, was hijacked by 4 Palestinian terrorists, and it didn't end well for anybody. An American disabled passenger, Leon Klinghoffer, was shot and thrown overboard. The ship was held for some amount of time, and it created, well, in addition to sort of being the foundation for the movie Top Gun, it created some other, generated other diplomatic effects, caused hurt feelings among allies, Italy, Egypt, the United States. And so as a result, Italy led an effort at the IMO to develop a treaty that countries could then agree to. And the first treaty, the 1988 treaty, is based upon an obligation of states to either prosecute or extradite terrorists at sea or criminals at sea, armed hijackers at sea. The treaty was revised. In fact, it was basically entirely rewritten in 2005. And that was, of course, after 9/11. And the negotiations led to major sections which now include interdiction of terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. And so this is another potentially very useful apparatus. In a nutshell, if you're familiar with the Proliferation Security Initiative, this agreement codifies many of those provisions into a legally binding treaty, unlike the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is an informal network of countries. Now, with regard to naval warfare, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip most of it. You have questions that you're going to address on this, and you'll have, I think all of the sections have a JAG within your groups on Monday, so you're not sort of flying solo. Just a couple of things, though, to keep in mind, because I'd like to reserve some time for questions, and that is that in addition to the peacetime visit board search and seizure rules, I talked about some of them. There are a few others that are sort of less important, but we talked about the main ones. There is a wartime right of visit and search. This is a right, not a privilege. It's a right that belligerents can take to board the ships of both neutral countries and belligerents in order to determine the enemy character of the ship. What does that mean? Basically, you can check to see whether the ship is aiding the enemy. And so there are disagreements over where you draw those lines, such as location. What if Israel and Gaza have a recognized armed conflict, and yet a ship like the Mavi Marmara that was boarded in 2010 is boarded in the Pacific Ocean, far from Gaza? Can you make a claim that, well, that's not really a lawful exercise of the right of visit and search? Some people argue that. The classic law is that this right of visit and search applies worldwide. It doesn't matter. If you think about World War I or World War II, both belligerents boarded neutral ships all over the world to check to make sure that those neutral ships were indeed neutral and were not aiding the enemy. What's the consequences for a breach or attempted breach? A boarding can be made on a non-permissive basis or a forced entry basis, and ultimately a neutral ship can be sent to the bottom of the sea if it does not comply with this right of visit and search. Well, that's all I have. I'll open it up for questions. Everybody wake up.